Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the witty and terrible literary escape room that is the Book Club Blind Entry podcast for the Reading Room CLE. My name is Casey, and I am your host. Every week, I read a book in its entirety and do research into the background of the book and its author. I then send my co-host a 10-page excerpt devoid of page numbers, a title, or the author. In the next 20 minutes, my co-host and I will try to reconcile our differing perspectives to see how much one socially distanced excerpt deviates from the meaning of the entire book. Today, my co-host is Peter, my dad.
Hello.
Hello. So, Dad, I know a little bit about what you normally read, but the listeners don't, so why don't you summarize?
I generally read historical nonfiction, and I'll mix in some Stephen King-style page-turners for fun.
Michael Crichton?
Yes, yeah. John Grisham, popular authors.
What did you think of The Associate?
I don't remember.
I thought it was garbage.
That's a good perspective.
Thank you. Did the excerpt that you read did you find that compared to anything perhaps written by John Grisham or Michael Crichton?
No, I don't think so. It was more like, it more compared to like self-published science fiction stuff that you find on Amazon.
Do you mean that in a good way?
Probably not.
Okay. So why don't you summarize then for the listeners what happens in the excerpt?
So what happens in the excerpt is the main character is sitting in his apartment and he hears someone trying to break down his door. So he opens up a safe and erases a tape, which is never again referenced in the excerpt that I was sent. And then two people break down the door and come in, and the main character is very calm about this whole thing. And it's like a giant wrestler guy and a skinny little small guy. And they sit down and have a fairly confusing conversation about what this kid knows or doesn't know, but they really don't seem to care what he says. And then they ask him what he values in his apartment and tell him that they'll respect that. And so he tells them the things that he values, and then they break all that stuff, and he just sits there and drinks a beer and watches them.
So did you have any suspicions as to what might have been going on under the surface? Any ulterior motives? There seems to be an understanding between the two of them, between the two groups.
The main character referenced the fact that he had been in contact with someone who was called the Professor, and that he had been admitted to the Professor's laboratory, and that the two villains who broke into the apartment seemed to feel that the kid's association with the Professor would have some value for them, but none of that is clear in terms of exactly what's going on. And it also hints that this is some type of dystopian novel because it talks about multiple factions with names like the System and the Factory and a few underground groups. So it seems to be like a futurist political drama that's playing out. And it also seems to be taking place in Europe because they use the archaic and crazy metric system.
You think so?
No, I know that they do. They referenced everything was in metric measures.
So then that makes it take place in Europe.
I thought so. It was either Europe or somewhere where they use metric.
That's so interesting. This is not set in Europe remotely, but I did not know that this country actually used the metric system. It doesn't surprise me at all. Were you able to infer anything about the time period in which this was set based on what was in the apartment?
I'm assuming that it's set in the future, because it referenced something called a video deck, which is not something that exists. And they had kind of a funny name for the television, but also referred to it as a television. They were drinking Coke. I would expect that it is set in the future, but not hundreds of years in the future, the fairly near future.
Do you think it might have been written for the future, but maybe further back from now? Like maybe it wasn't written in the past 5 years, but it was still set in the future? It's like Back to the Future.
It's possible. I would say that with the reference to the fact that they immediately asked for Coke and pulled Coke out of the refrigerator, it wasn't that far back, like maybe, no more than 20 years ago, I would say.
Yeah, no, that is a good point. Do you foresee the two men who enter his apartment being present in the rest of the book or even before?
It's impossible to say. Like they might have done some type of context setting up front, but my suspicion would be that that's the first time those two characters are introduced.
Just because they don't seem to know each other, yet he knows what to expect from them, which which is why he doesn't resist when they go about and break all of his stuff.
Oh, are you asking if the main character knew these other two guys?
Yeah.
I think he did not know the other two guys earlier in the book. And I think he didn't resist them breaking their stuff because I think he quickly did the math that when someone was going to break in, there was nothing he was going to do about it anyway. And he referenced the fact that he thought about running away, but he's like, what good is that going to do? Yeah. And so I think he just takes that approach to conflict, which is surrendering to it rather than trying to resist it.
So he just drinks and just watches his apartment go to shit.
Yes, and doesn't seem to offer much of a complaint.
Though it makes sense. Did you find that odd?
Yeah, I found it to be a problem with the writing. Like, it made me not want to read the rest of the book because I thought that the main character's reactions were not believable, and he was almost devoid of any type of human emotion.
Yeah, it's almost like he should have put up more resistance. It read to me very similarly to Camus, like in The Stranger. You have Meursault, who is very just devoid of anything, and like he's sitting at his funeral and his mom's dead and he won't cry, and he's just itching and he's hating how light it is in the room. He wants coffee, and that's what he's thinking about when his mother's casket is right there. And it's very similar to this guy sitting there and be like, okay, you can smash my TV, but can I have a beer, please? You know, it's almost a direct parallel.
Yeah, he seems to express disappointment that they broke his TV, but that's as far as it went. And as I remember, I think it was written in the first person, and there was really no, like, this is what I think about this. It was just, this is what's happening.
That's very on par with this author's style. This author, I don't know if you've noticed, writes in a very surrealist way. And I mentioned earlier in one of my episodes that a major tenet of surrealism is that you don't look for the meaning underlying what happens, and you stop trying to connect the dots and make sense of it. Instead, you interrogate your emotional reactions to what happens just in itself. It matters less why this happened than why I'm reacting this way. And it's meant to get at this more primal machinery of human behavior and human perception. But this novel does very much come off as a thriller. And thrillers are very formulaic. You have your setup of villains and you have your setup of protagonists, and there's a really urgent issue, and there's normally going to be some sort of countdown that will resolve almost at the end of the book. There's normally something very, very much in danger. But yeah, this lack of emotion in this excerpt stays present in a lot of the book, and it definitely throws off the mood of the formula of the thriller that it's set against. And that may have been an intentional choice, is to pair this Meursault character with the thriller, where you're supposed to have like some Michael Crichton character who's learning to speak a new language in a day because his girlfriend's going to get murdered or something. Did you have any guesses towards the identity of the author? Like, is woman, man, neither? What country were they from? What do they know? What do they like?
Well, one of the references in the story is that the main character stole an ashtray from a restaurant or a bar. So it's somewhere where people at the time were smoking indoors. I believed that it was a European, South American, whatever the case may be, non-American author, and had the sense that it was like a self-published science fiction writer.
How many revisions do you think this book went through?
I really don't know. You know, if someone is self-published, there's perhaps less editorial scrutiny before they are published than if they're going through a regular publishing channel. You could presumably make revisions even after you publish it the first time and continue to update it, particularly if it's an electronic work. I would guess it went through several, and probably what a normal writing process would require.
You know, you're super right. This author normally will edit his work. It's a man, by the way. Edit his work 6 or 7 times. And he actually really heavily relies on his wife. And his wife tells him that he is not her favorite author.
That's funny.
Okay, hey guys, quick fact check. I watched a video on YouTube that claimed Murakami would write 6 or 7 versions, but the sources for that are super unconfirmed. I have found an article in the Paris Review that says, well, he says it takes him 4 or 5, and I will link that in the description below. I read a few interviews of the author, and he speaks nearly exactly the same way that he writes. And I know a lot of people that don't write remotely similarly to the way he speaks, but it almost takes a little bit of the authenticity out of it. You question whether he's really being creative if he has one tone. He does have voices for a few other of the characters, It's interesting because at the beginning of this story, he starts talking about how he really likes larger women. And there's this very young woman that he meets as he's still like descending in an elevator to do a job. And she's extremely flirtatious. He's like, get away from me. And there are two different librarians in this book, because this book bounces back and forth between two different worlds. Both of them have a librarian who is very slender and who are both sex appeals. So it's very strange for him to go about in the beginning being like, oh, well, I'm into larger women. There's this thing about them that I have like been into before. And then he never addresses how much he likes librarians, but that is glaringly apparent, which is just... What I did like about the character not caring was that you can have a thriller with a character that doesn't care. Like, I really liked that someone was just like, fuck it, I'm just going to write this because this needs to exist. And I really like that this guy can do this. And the author just creates these very strange and dissociative moments. One is where in the pair that break into his apartment, there's a small man and he gets very angry and he keeps telling the man, stop getting upset that we're breaking your apartment. And the guy's like, no, but I am upset. And the small guy's like, no, there are more important things to think about. Stop being upset about this. I think it's about his fridge, and he brings it up a third time, and the little man like grabs his gold lighter and just like throws it against the fridge in a fit of rage, and then he's completely done.
So that was in the excerpt you sent me.
Yeah.
He was complaining about the fact that they broke his door.
Yeah. So you'll just have these very small moments that don't really align with what the mood of the scene is supposed to be. He'll take conventional setup. He'll be like, oh, he's got a sexy car and there's a woman here. And then whatever character he's speaking of will do something that you don't expect or act in a way that you don't expect. And it creates these very small and comedic moments. Like, it's a very great way to interrogate why that makes you feel weird.
I did think that was strange about the scene because the little man got so frustrated that he threw his lighter against the refrigerator and dented it, and all the while he has the big ogre guy sitting there. And you'd think that if he got that angry, he would tell the ogre guy to like beat the kid up or something, but he never did. Like, he's got this hulking threat of violence sitting right there, but instead he gets so furious that he throws his lighter at the refrigerator and then just drops it.
And then he's done. Actually, I suspect that they probably had orders not to hurt him because the professor hired both of them to come in and break into his apartment and scare the shit out of him.
That's interesting. Why would the professor do that?
It's revealed later in the book that, okay, so in the beginning of the book, the professor hires the guy to come do a job for him, and the main character is this sort of human computer, and he can do these abstracted operations. One is called shuffling, where he's had this surgery that separates two of his like brain lobes, and then he transfers data back and forth in these complex algorithms, and he can't be conscious for it. He has to like say this code to himself and then knock himself out so he can actually shuffle the data, and then he wakes up almost as if he's been transformed into a werewolf or something. All of his data is done and he has no memory of what happened. His job description, he's called like a calcutech, but he just does math for a living. So the professor hires him to help him calculate sounds coming out of skulls, and he gifts him with a unicorn skull. And the two men supposedly break into his apartment later on looking for the unicorn skull. But in the end of the book, it's revealed that the unicorn skull was this phony replica that he used to scare the main character into doing what he says and being like, if you don't finish these calculations, help me fix sound in the world and all of the world's going to die. And then he sends him this thing that's supposed to imply that mythical creatures are real. But in the end of the book, it's revealed that the professor was the one in the system, right? You hear that the system is this abstract body that is a main group of interest in the book. He did surgery on a ton of other calcutechs for the system, and he is one of the only people to survive that surgery. One of the things that the professor installed in his brain is this circuitry that is going to make him enter his internal subconscious and never come out. Then, towards the end of the book, he has his last days on Earth, and he enters his subconscious brain, and throughout the whole thing, you've been bouncing back and forth between his subconscious where he goes and then him slowly figuring out what's going on in the real world where he is. And at the end of the book, he has a choice to escape his subconscious and go back to being a human being again. And there's like an agent in his subconscious that convinces him that this is a good idea. And at the last moment, he's like, no, I'm going to stay. And then his agent leaves. He stays, and then that's the end of the book.
Did you like the book?
You know, the first book I read by this author, I really, really liked. It was his masterpiece. It was written very differently. I found the voice to be very different. But this work is much, much earlier on, and I also knew what to expect coming from him, and I actually really like absurdist fiction, so I wasn't really expecting it to be a conventional thriller. I wasn't expecting it to be something I could predict, and I also really liked The Stranger. I really liked these very strange and dissociated, apathetic characters, so I liked that. I kind of liked that you could kind of identify with him and sit back and just watch his whole life blow up and just be like, oh.
Would you make it into a movie?
You know, I could. It would be a comedy, but I could. This author's name is Haruki Murakami. I actually read him last week for a friend of mine, and my friend was also a bit disturbed by the lack of subtlety in the author's phrasing, and I noticed that you did not really appreciate that either.
Yes, that's correct.
And he is a Japanese surrealist author. He's been writing for a long time. And I actually chose this book for you because in the description for it, it has references to Bob Dylan, John Coltrane, Lord Jim, science fiction. And Murakami was enamored with detective novels from like the 80s. Growing up, he would read tons of detective novels written by American authors, and he loved like American culture. So his novels in the beginning didn't do that well because it didn't really resonate with Japanese audiences, but now he's actually extremely widely read worldwide by people in their 20s and 30s. And I thought it was interesting that you said this character seems like a kid because in the novel, he identifies as 35 years old. You may still consider that a kid for all I know.
I do.
All right, then. It's not really my idea of a kid as a 21-year-old, but good to know. Yeah, so do you have any questions that you would want to know about this guy?
About the character or about the author?
About the author, about the book, because I gave you a very brief and garbled synopsis, and you may want to know more.
If this was the only book that you read from this author, would you be interested in reading a second book, or would you put it down and say, okay, that's enough?
I would probably put it down and say, okay, that's enough. I'm glad this is not the first book that I read, and I'm glad I already knew what to expect before going in, because I would have been totally thrown.
When you read the first book by the author that you did like, How did you find it, and what encouraged you to read it?
I found the prose to be much more subtle, and there was way more complicated and nuanced transition from a character's story to another character's story. He actually really indulges himself in his masterpiece, and he really delves into the other characters' stories in a way that he doesn't in the other books that I've read. Like, it will go and spend 5 or 6 extremely dense pages talking about some battle in World War II in Japan that went down, or in Manchuria or something. And they'll go into this woman's backstory from like when she was a child, and that will take another full 5 pages of the book. So you're not only enamored with this main character who is seemingly apathetic, but you are also enamored with all of these other characters who you know so well, many of whom care, and all of whom are really, really weird. Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to articulate, but yeah, did that answer your question?
It did. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, Dad. Well, this has been Book Club Blind Entries. Thank you so much for coming on. To the listeners, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time with a new co-host.